Martin Bormann, Adolf Hitler's personal secretary, wrote to Alfred Rosenberg on February 22, 1940. What is therefore necessary, in my opinion, is the development of a brief guideline on a National Socialist way of life. To such a guideline belong, for example, the commandment of bravery, the prohibition of cowardice, the commandment of love for the psychic nature in which God manifests himself also in animals and plants, the commandment to keep the blood pure. In addition, it should contain principles, since they are also accepted in the Decalogue of the Old Testament, insofar as they can be seen as moral principles of any ethno-national life. The publication of such a guideline could and should only derive from our National Socialist way of life. Its moral commandments do not need to be justified by reference to any kind of dogmas of faith about the creation of life and the continued existence of souls after death. Bormann, in his circular letter to the German Gauleiters of June 6, 1941, wrote, "National Socialist and Christian ideas are incompatible. The Christian churches are based on the ignorance of the people and strive to maintain this lack of knowledge of the majority of the population, since only in this way can the Christian churches preserve their power. In contrast, National Socialism is based on scientific foundations. Christianity had unalterable principles that were established almost 2,000 years ago and which have increasingly solidified into unrealistic dogmas. National Socialism, on the other hand, if it wants to continue to fulfill its task in the future, must be adjusted according to the latest knowledge from scientific research. The Christian churches have always recognized the dangers of exact scientific discoveries that threaten their existence and therefore strive to suppress or falsify scientific research with the dogma of a theology akin to pseudoscience. Our national view of the world, however, is far above the concepts of Christianity, which in their essential points are taken from Judaism. This is also why we don't need Christianity. No one would know anything about Christianity if it hadn't been forced down their throats from childhood by the clerics. The so-called dear God does not provide the young human being with the knowledge of his existence from the outset, but surprisingly leaves it to the efforts of the clerics, despite their omnipotence. If, in the future, our youth learn nothing more of this Christianity, whose teachings are far below our own, Christianity will disappear of its own accord. It is also surprising that human beings knew nothing of this Christian God before our modern reckoning of time, and yet since that time, by far the largest part of the Earth's population has never learned anything of this Christian God, and is therefore condemned to hell according to the somewhat presumptuous but Christian view. When we National Socialists speak of belief in God, we don't mean, like the Christian fools and their spiritual exploiters, a being like man sitting somewhere in the universe. On the contrary, we must open people's eyes to the fact that beyond our small Earth, the most insignificant in the great universe, there are countless other bodies which, like the sun, are surrounded by planets, which in turn are surrounded by moons. The nomological force with which all these countless planets move around the universe we call omnipotence or God. The assertion that this universal force could take care of the fate of every being, of every tiny terrestrial bacillus, that it could be influenced by so-called prayers or other surprising things, is based on a great deal of naivety or diligent insolence. In contrast, we National Socialists demand of ourselves that we live as naturally as possible, i.e., according to the laws of life. The more exactly we recognize and defend the laws of nature and life, the more we act in accordance with them, the more we agree with the will of omnipotence. The more we again have a vision of the will of omnipotence, the greater our successes will be. The incompatibility of National Socialist and Christian ideas results in the demand that a strengthening of existing Christian confessions and the promotion of new, developing Christian confessions be rejected by us. No difference should be made here between individual Christian confessions. For this reason, therefore, the idea of establishing a Protestant Reich Church by merging the various Protestant churches has been abandoned forever, because the Protestant churches are just as hostile to us as the Catholic Church. Any strengthening of the Protestant Church would only have an adverse effect on us. In a letter to his wife dated February 21, 1944, Bormann wrote, "Anyone who feels himself to be a creature of this life and encompassed by this life, in other words, by the will of omnipotence of nature, that is, by the will of God, anyone who feels himself to be only one of the innumerable meshes in the net we call the people cannot be frightened by the difficulties of this existence,